Imagine crossing an ocean to a new world, leaving everything behind with the hope of finding freedom and opportunity, only to face the unimaginable. The untold stories of African settlers in America will challenge everything you thought you knew about the founding of this nation. Today, we're uncovering a hidden chapter of history, one where the lives of African settlers and their treatment varied in ways that have long been buried in the past. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a part of history that has been overshadowed for centuries. The story of African settlers who arrived in America long before slavery became the dominant narrative. These settlers came with dreams, skills, and hopes, just like the Europeans. But how were they treated? How did their experiences differ across the colonies? The truth may surprise you. Stick around as we reveal the forgotten history of these pioneers and the ways they were treated. Stories that have been left out of the history books for too long. 1. The early African settlers, a forgotten chapter. Most people associate African migration to America with the transatlantic slave trade. But few know that Africans came to the New World long before that dark chapter. In the early 1500s, Africans arrived as free men and women, explorers, traders, and skilled workers. They traveled to colonies alongside Europeans, seeking new opportunities in the Americas. Some worked alongside Spanish explorers like Estevanico, a Moroccan Berber who became one of the first known Africans to explore what is now the United States. These early African settlers often lived and worked alongside Europeans. In some cases, they were treated as equals, receiving land grants, participating in the establishment of new colonies, and even holding leadership positions. For example, there were documented cases of African landowners in early Virginia and Maryland during the 17th century. This was a time before race-based slavery fully took hold, and the treatment of African settlers was vastly different from the horrors that would later define their experiences in America. Why don't we hear more about these African pioneers? Their stories were systematically erased or forgotten, overshadowed by the growing institution of slavery that came to dominate American society. But their legacy still lingers in forgotten records and oral histories that reveal a complex and nuanced story of African presence in the Americas. 2. The rise of race-based slavery, a shift in treatment. As the colonies grew, so did their demand for labor. The treatment of African settlers began to shift drastically in the mid-1600s as European settlers increasingly relied on forced labor to grow their agricultural economies. What started as a society where race was not the defining factor in a person's status transformed into one where skin color became synonymous with enslavement. In places like Virginia and the Carolinas, laws were enacted to strip Africans of their rights. Free Africans who had once owned land and lived as equals to Europeans were suddenly subject to new restrictions. These laws laid the foundation for the racial caste system that would later become the backbone of American slavery. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 was a pivotal moment. During the uprising, both black and white indentured servants fought alongside each other against the wealthy elite. This alliance frightened the ruling class, leading them to pass even more restrictive laws that would drive a wedge between poor whites and Africans. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 are a stark example of how the colonies institutionalized race-based slavery, ensuring that Africans, whether free or enslaved, would be treated differently from whites. What does this tell us? The move from a diverse society to one where Africans were systematically oppressed didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated process that shaped the future of race relations in America. 3. Different colonies, different treatment, a varied experience. The treatment of African settlers wasn't uniform across all colonies. Depending on where they settled, Africans experienced vastly different conditions. In the northern colonies, like Massachusetts and New York, some Africans lived as free men and women, working in trades or owning property. They were often seen as part of the community, though they still faced discrimination. In contrast, the southern colonies, with their focus on agriculture, were more reliant on slave labor. African settlers in these regions quickly found themselves trapped in an ever-growing system of slavery. Even free Africans were not immune from the harsh realities of life in the southern colonies, where the color of their skin marked them for a life of labor and restriction. The Spanish and French colonies offered yet another dynamic. In places like Florida and Louisiana, Africans had more opportunities to earn their freedom. The Spanish system of coartación, for example, allowed enslaved Africans to buy their freedom and integrate into society. These communities of free Africans, known as gens de couleur libres in Louisiana, flourished in ways that were unimaginable in the English colonies. Why such differences? Each colonial power had its own legal and cultural approach to race and slavery. The English colonies moved toward a rigid racial hierarchy, while the Spanish and French colonies allowed for more fluid social structures, although inequality still existed. 4. Resistance and resilience, the African response. Despite the growing oppression, African settlers were not passive victims. From the earliest days, they resisted their mistreatment and fought for their rights. Some, like Anthony Johnson, a former Angolan who gained his freedom in Virginia, became landowners and even owned indentured servants, including Europeans. Johnson's story is an example of the complexity of African life in the early colonies, where social mobility was still possible despite growing racial divisions. Others, like the Maroons in the Caribbean and the Gullah people of the American South, created independent communities where African traditions, language, and culture were preserved. These communities offered a form of resistance against the encroaching forces of European domination, serving as a reminder of the strength and resilience of the African spirit. Enslaved Africans also rebelled, sometimes in dramatic uprisings, like the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, where enslaved Africans attempted to fight their way to freedom. Though many of these rebellions were suppressed, they served as a powerful reminder that the African community in America was far from submissive. What does this tell us about the African experience in America? It's a story of resistance, resilience, and survival. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, African settlers found ways to fight back and retain their humanity. 5. Legacy and reflection. What can we learn? The untold history of African settlers in America is a story that challenges the conventional narrative. It forces us to re-examine the early history of this country and to recognize the contributions and struggles of Africans long before the institution of slavery became dominant. These early settlers were not just victims of oppression. They were pioneers, landowners, leaders, and fighters. Their legacy lives on in the African American communities that continue to thrive today. From the cultural traditions passed down through generations to the enduring spirit of resistance, the early African settlers laid the foundation for the rich and diverse African American identity that exists today. So, what can we take away from this untold chapter of history? It's clear that the story of Africans in America is far more complex than we were taught. From free settlers to enslaved individuals, their experiences were as varied as the lands they arrived in. The way they were treated reveals not only the dark realities of racial oppression, but also the resilience and strength that has endured through the centuries. Now, I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about today's story? Did you know about the early African settlers and their experiences? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and share this video with anyone who needs to know this important history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another journey into the hidden corners of history.